Well, thank you all for coming out this evening, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome tonight Professor Houri Berberian, the Meghrouni Family Presidential Chair in Armenian Studies at the University of California, Irvine, a wonderful colleague and fellow Berkeley graduate. Both of us received our BA from Berkeley, but unlike me, Dr. Berberian immediately made two very clear commitments, both of which I'm quite envious of. Her first commitment was to keep moving south and not having to purchase winter boots, woolen mittens, and hats. From our common alma mater in the sunny but often foggy Bay Area, she moved 368 miles to Los Angeles, where she was not only going to embrace everlasting sunshine, but also receive both her MA and PhD in history from UCLA. She worked with two powerhouses in their respective fields, Richard Hovhannissian in Armenian Studies and the world-renowned Nikki Keddie in Middle Eastern and Iranian Studies to complete her dissertation. With a distinct love for freedom in hand, she chose to make California her permanent home by moving south again, this time 30 miles instead of 300 miles to Cal State Long Beach, where she taught Middle Eastern history for 17 years and served as the director of Middle Eastern Studies for part of it. She was much adored by her students, one saying that she absolutely loved her and described her as the first ever instructor that she wanted to be friends with. Even though Dr. Berberian was the toughest grader yet, had the highest expectations, and obviously made you read a lot. Dr. Berberian, despite the clear appreciation of her students and colleagues at Long Beach, decided, however, to move yet a few more miles south. And it was in 2016 when she was called to spearhead a new program in Armenian Studies and was named the Meghrouni Family Presidential Chair in Armenian Studies at the University of California, Irvine. In the short period that she has been there, she has built up the Armenian language program and has created a minor in Armenian Studies. Her important appointment speaks to the second commitment Dr. Berberian made already during her years in the Bay Area. She made the decision to devote her entire academic career to Armenian Studies. From her dissertation titled Love for Freedom Knows No Fatherland, I love that title, The Politicization of Armenians and the Iranian Constitutional Revolution of 1905, from 1905 to 1911, which was then published as a monograph in 2001. Through the many articles she published to her most recent book, Roving, Revolutionaries, Armenians and the Connected Revolutions in the Russian, Iranian, and Ottoman world. Here, Armenian revolutionaries, Armenian women, and Armenians in connected, entangled, and global contexts have been at the very heart of her work. Roving Revolutionaries is the basis of today's talk, and the book is quite revolutionary itself. Roving Revolutionary not only has received praise as being groundbreaking and theoretically sophisticated and shattering the walls of insular history, as Dr. Berberian looks at the overlooked interconnections between three revolutions with erudition and panache. I love that. But also it was just honored at the most recent Middle East Studies Association's annual meeting with the Armenian Studies Outstanding Book Award. Roving Revolutions is a work that no doubt asks us to think big while we are invited to observe the acumen of a historian who digs deep. Dr. Berberian works on three levels, the global, the regional, and the local, and in three spaces, the Ottoman, Russian, and Qajar empires. All three being multi-ethnic empires that at the turn of the century were the sites of three contiguous and overlapping revolutions. The mediating, connecting, and interceding compound that binds Dr. Berberian's entanglements are, as you already can imagine or guessed, are Armenian revolutionaries. Dr. Berberian contextualizes the Armenian revolutionary movement within the profound acceleration of mobility in the 19th century, Railways, steamships, the post, telegraph moved men, arms, and ideas. It is a story of movement that perhaps makes us think of the growth of the capitalist market and the trade of guns and ammunition. But what Dr. Berberian highlights are other movements that of course are not unfamiliar, namely the movement of people and ideas, but that in this case of Armenian involvement in these three moments, the radical quest for change has of course been ignored. Her revolutionaries move from cell to cell, not unlike, as Dr. Berberian writes, the 14th-century traveler Ibn Battuta, whose travels were facilitated by a wide network of Muslim communities from Africa to East Asia. Armenian revolutionaries took shelter among their compatriots in Baku, Batumi, Yerevan, Kars, Moscow, Sassoon, Van, Erzurum, Gumri, Tabriz, Cairo, Izmir, Kayseri, Geneva, and Paris, to name only a few. Characters like Rostam, I'm sure we're going to meet him today, traded passports, smuggled chemicals, and operated across borders in, I quote, a radical and polyglot world. The radical world the revolutionaries were entangled in was that of a global craze for constitutionalism, the potential for federalism, and like many other left revolutionaries of their time, a radical rethinking of society via socialism. While Armenian revolutionaries are the material for a Hollywood thriller, Rostam perhaps best played by the Mission Impossible lead of Tom Cruise. It is the larger discussions, the big questions that Dr. Berberian can ask here that are of great import. Not only does the work highlight the compression of time and space, but it also exposes the ideological empathies of the Armenian revolutionary movement in such a nuanced fashion that the old idea of Armenian nationalism as a determined, homogeneous, singular, and exclusive motivation factor for agitation against authoritarian regimes can no longer stand. This is a significant revision, I think, of Armenian historiography that will have to be considered by scholars and students of Armenian history and society alike, as they examine not only the 19th century in general, but also the violence against Armenians as it culminates in the 1915 catastrophe in particular. And with this in mind, I will turn over the floor to Dr. Houri Berberian. Please help me welcome her.
I've been asked to put this on. Hey, that is perhaps the best introduction I have ever heard. I'm serious, not just about me, about anyone. So thank you very much, Melanie. And thank you also to the Armenian Studies program for the invitation to be here. It's a great pleasure to be back and to see so many familiar faces and new ones as well. So I'm wondering whether I should be moving further south to Mexico. But maybe next time when I'm back we'll see. So I thought about what I should talk to you today about. I thought about what I wanted to leave you with, what I wanted you to know about my new book, and I'm not sure I can top Melanie, but I will try. And I could try to fit into a 40-minute lecture everything I cover in the book, but that would be insanity, and you'd rightly walk out in protest if you were still awake. So I want to impart to you the most important and novel things about my study that I think I do, and not to leave you here with a bunch of facts and details, but actually an overall picture of why I worked on the book, why it was important to me, what's significant about it, and in the end, why you should care enough to read it. Ultimately, that's what I'm interested in. So what does the book try to do? We can start with that. So the book explores the connectedness of the Russian, Ottoman, and Iranian revolutions, by using, and those are the dates, by using the case of Armenian revolutionaries to understand how the revolutions were connected. The three revolutions were similar to other revolutionary waves in the Atlantic world before and after the French Revolution of 1789, Europe in 1848, and also coincided with other revolutions in other parts of the world. Portugal, 1910, Mexico, 1911, and China, 1912. The three revolutions that I'm interested in, the Russian, Ottoman, and the Iranian, drew strength from each other's successes and attempted to effect change in their own particular revolutions. Our three revolutions shared a great deal with others. They took markedly similar paths. Progressive movements toppled autocratic states and initiated the beginnings of popular sovereignty, constitutional rule, parliaments, freedoms, and so forth. But they did not successfully implement or guarantee them. All revolutions were followed by coup d'etat initiated by more conservative forces. But what's most important for us is that in all cases, but in varying degrees, the revolutions involved the collaboration of linguistically and ethno-religiously diverse imperial subjects, like the Armenians, and the adaptation of European Enlightenment ideas, as well as socialism in its many variants. The book looks at the prevalent crisscrossing or circulation of Armenian revolutionaries, weapons, print, as well as ideas through these revolutions and across the South Caucasus, Asia Minor, Iran, as well as Europe. And it does so within the context of transformations in transportation and communication. In particular, it analyzes the ideas, the weight of ideas like constitutionalism, federalism, and socialism, all of which filtered through the frontiers via revolutionaries and workers, as well as circulars and newspapers, and were adapted to or indigenized under local conditions. I apply two key approaches to the study of these revolutions and Armenians that are both novel and I think absolutely crucial in trying to understand them. First is a connected histories approach, and what I call from the connected histories approach, connected revolutions, which I apply to the study of these early 20th century revolutions. Now, what is a connected histories approach? Connected history is used rather loosely to mean anything that's connected. People are connected, everything's connected, so it's a connected history. But here, this is actually a specific systematic exploration of the circulation of ideas, individuals, and objects. So connected histories through circulation, not just that they're connected because all things in the world are connected. In our case, it's a circulation of Armenian revolutionaries. The weapons they used, the print they read, the print they circulated, and the global ideologies they adapted, like socialism, federalism, constitutionalism. And it is substantially, this connected histories approach, or connected revolutions in this case, is substantially different from comparative history. In that comparative history considers ideas, people's objects, the same things, but it does so in relation to one another. What is different, what is similar. Connected histories looks at these things through one another in terms of relationships, interactions, and circulation. Therefore, it focuses on real connections between regions that otherwise have been studied largely in isolation. The second thing that the book does is it insists on a global approach when studying the revolutions and the Armenians. It focuses on turn of the 20th century global transformations that smoothed the road toward revolution and facilitated the circulation of revolutionaries. Critical to a meaningful understanding of these revolutions is an appreciation of the global context or conjuncture that allows us to see them beyond their regional setting and local particularities and in light of larger transformations. The extent of circulation of these revolutionaries took place particularly from the late 19th to the early 20th century, witnessed significant shifts in technologies of global communication and transportation that began radically to transform people's lives and resulted in an important new round of what David Harvey has called time-space compression, or the accelerated shrinking of the world. And if you look at this map that he has in his book, The Condition of Postmodernity, obviously he shows the compression or the shrinking of the world, and I don't think I need to tell you it didn't actually physically shrink, but I'm saying it anyway, just in case. So this is the period that we're interested in, and of course, if he were to have taken, if we are to take this further to today, it would probably be a dot on this map. So the idea is what does David Harvey mean by a time-space compression or shrinking of the world? He's basically talking about advances in technology in terms of transportation and communication, steamship, railway, telegraph, even a print boom, that led to faster and therefore more frequent travel, right, by railway and steamship, communication by telegraph, and think of the telegraph in terms of today's tweet, across wider distances, thus shrinking the time it took for people to get from one place to another, right? So it was faster, and it was therefore more common and more frequent. So this gave the impression that the world had actually become smaller, that it had shrunk, because it had become more easily accessible. But what's also important to remember is that at the same time that the world seemed to be shrinking, it also seemed to be expanding, because these same technologies made available a range of ideas, encounters, and exchanges between peoples, thus magnifying the available and reachable horizons. So this two-pronged consequence of time-space compression, shrinking and expanding, was actually instrumental in connecting our revolutions, because it made possible the circulation of revolutionary operatives and intellectuals, as well as ideas and ideologies that fueled these revolutions. And our revolutionaries used all modes of transportation and communication. We know from their correspondence, from the documents they left behind, that they used anything from conventional roads and postal mail to the relatively new and much more rapid steamship, railway, and telegraph to mobilize themselves, as well as to circulate arms, print, and information across 3 imperial frontiers of the region and beyond, to and from the Balkans, Western Europe, even North America, all within the revolutionary period from 1904 to 1912. And these very technologies, especially the railways and the telegraph, were actually put in place by states in order to control its populations, and were in turn used by these revolutionaries against the states themselves. It's beautiful. So the Armenian Revolutionaries are basically some of the most active and dynamic boundary crossers to connect all 3 revolutions through the use of these 3 technologies. So how does a historian reconstruct the world of Armenians and connected revolutions? In other words, what are the sources? How do we go about this? The study is grounded in empirical evidence derived from original sources, and it is the sources that feed the theoretical considerations and drive the argument, and not the other way around. I rely on the almost untapped, published and unpublished Armenian language documentation of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, the Tashnaktschun, the dominant Armenian transnational political party crossing the figurative and literal frontiers of the Russian, Ottoman, and Iranian states and revolutionary movements. These papers also contain a much smaller number of documents in other languages, not just Armenian, French, Persian, Russian, Ottoman, Turkish, English, and so forth. They include correspondence, minutes of meetings, congresses, circulars, details of debates, decisions, and so forth. The archival documents cover a wide global network from anywhere that the ARF has had a presence, and that's pretty much anywhere, Central Asia, Cuba, wherever you want. Of course, not in the same numbers as the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire or even Qajar, Iran. And they contain documents not only about the ARF, but anybody that had contact with the ARF. So, for example, the second leading party, the Hanchakyan party, which does not have its own archives like the ARF does in Watertown, Massachusetts, and that's another story altogether. You can find out things about the Hanchakyan party through the ARF, the Armenian Revolutionary Federation archives. I also utilized for the first time in a systematic way more than 24 contemporary Armenian language periodicals from major cities and centers of political activity in the South Caucasus, the Ottoman Empire, and Iran and Europe. Many of these newspapers had very short lives, and my favorite one is the one that was forced to shut down but reappeared under different names and had more lives than a cat, appearing in 15 reincarnations from 1906 to 1909. And this was a Tiflis paper, belonged to the ARF. So it actually also reminds me of the Islamic Republic and how newspapers get shut down and then reappear under a different guise. So what does a close reading of these sources tell us about why and how Armenians participated in and connect revolutions? So at the turn of the century, Armenians, and I'm going to try to go through this a little more quickly with the assumption that many of you have a handle on this part of Armenian history anyway, I hope. Okay, so at the turn of the century, Armenians constituted a minority in three empires, the Ottoman, the Russian, and the Iranian, and there you see it in different colors, the Ottoman being green, the six Armenian provinces, not majority Armenian, but provinces where Armenians lived. The oranges are the Russian Empire, and the purple is obviously Qajar, Iran. In the Ottoman Empire, the number of Armenians is estimated to be about 2 million, maybe more, maybe less. And in the Russian Empire, largely in the South Caucasus, it's slightly over 1 million. And this is the audience participation part. How many Armenians do you think are in Iran in this period?
There are 500,000, yeah.
500,000?
Less, 200,000.
200,000. One more? One more guess? It's not an auction. About 75,000. Right, because of the 1828 Treaty of Turkmenchai, much of the provinces from Iran were taken by Russia, and those who were on the borders, Armenians, moved to the Russian Empire. So it's a very small number of Armenians, and yet they had the most important, significant impact on the Iranian constitutional revolution, more so than in the other two revolutions. So the power of small numbers. Okay, so the latter half of the 19th century was a particularly transformative period for the region, particularly in the Ottoman and the Russian Empire. It is a time of reforms implemented or not implemented, enacted but not necessarily implemented by the Ottoman Empire, by the Russian Empire, but also a time of discrimination, persecution in both empires, whether we're talking about the Hamidian massacres in the 1890s of the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, or we're talking about Russification and the confiscation of Armenian church properties in 1903 in the Russian Empire. So these two things existed at the same time, and Armenians were very much influenced by the Greek and Bulgarian independence movements and sought the assistance of Western powers, Western European powers, but also Russia, to bring either autonomy or reforms into these communities, and obviously failed. But in this attempt, when they began to see the failure of their of their attempts, they looked more and more to themselves and began to, I'm going very fast on this, began to organize, and they went from self-defense groups to large Armenian political parties. The Armenian Revolutionary Federation, established in 1890, is one of those large Armenian political parties. So momentous changes in the 19th and early 20th centuries not only shaped the making of these revolutions, but also the subjectivities of the revolutionaries who connected all three. By the time the revolutions began in 1905 or 1904, Armenian revolutionaries already had the experience and expertise necessary for revolutionary struggle on three fronts, because they had been actually carrying out a national revolutionary movement of their own in the Ottoman Empire and in the Russian Empire later. So their operations were already in place because of the foundation laid down by a national struggle and the development of a culture of resistance that had been in place for several decades. Both of these contributed to circulation, involvement, connection, and all of it was made feasible by not only their geographic presence in three empires, but also the easier transportation and communication due to the transformations we just talked about with time-space compression. To give you an idea, and this is not so that you can actually read everything on the map, but to give you an idea of what's going on here, here is a map of the different steamship routes throughout the globe about the period that we're talking about. And here are international cables, telegraph cables, about the same time as well. So you can see the activity in terms of transportation and communication, and of course the railways are not even, that would be impossible to show because there are so many local lines as well. It gives you an idea of the kinds of changes that were taking place that were not the case before the mid-19th century. So, my favorite revolutionary. And here he is shown in two ways. I consider the top a more revolutionary image, and the one at the bottom, I don't know, intellectual or bourgeois, I'm not sure which or both or whatever, but much more cleaned up, let's put it that way. So, co-founder of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, Rostom, that's his nom de guerre, his real name is Stepan Zoyan, is actually a great example of circulation and mobility. His trajectory is fascinating. He was born into an overlapping cultural zone that unambiguously reflected the time and space of 19th century South Caucasus in the village of Tsirna in Gortan, Nakhichevan, in Russian-ruled South Caucasus, today an exclave of Azerbaijan, bordering Armenia to the east and north, Iran to the south and west, and Turkey to the northwest. In a sense, he was born into the revolution, of the revolutionary period or revolutionary area. Now, Rostom lived and worked in Bulgaria, especially especially Philippe, Plovdiv, and Sofia, but also Varna on the Black Sea coast, Vienna, Geneva, Tiflis, Baku, Tabriz, Tehran, Istanbul, Erzurum, Garin, Van, and so forth, just to give you an idea. But for us, what's even more interesting or more important is that in 1905, during the Russian Revolution, Rostom was in the South Caucasus, where he convinced his party comrades of the importance of including the South Caucasus in their revolutionary struggle. In 1907 to 1908, he collaborated with Iranian constitutionalist leaders and consented to place the Armenian Revolutionary Federation at the service of the Iranian constitutional revolution. He took arms against royalists who were trying to halt the progress of the constitutionalist struggle. So not only did he sit down to come to an agreement with them, but he also participated militarily in the struggle. In 1909, Rostam turned up again, this time in the Ottoman Empire, after his party's involvement in the reinstatement of constitution and revolution. So Rostam's geographic mobility, and presented by this map that is also in the book, Rostam's geographic mobility, his appearance at pivotal moments in 3 different revolutionary struggles, his remarkable ease when operating in varied milieus, point to the critical circulation of revolutionaries as well as ideas, arms, and print. Rostam was one among many roving revolutionaries who made their way through these early 20th century revolutions. The same ease of transportation and communication excuse me, that facilitated revolutionary activity and circulation also facilitated the circulation of ideas. So this map, I think, does an excellent job. Obviously, it goes beyond the revolutionary period, and it starts before the revolutionary period, but it gives you an idea of how far east and how far west Rostam traveled, and sometimes, like right here, back and forth several times within months or years. And some of these routes are the same routes that ideas went through, and print went through, and weapons went through, including Rostam himself, who would do some explosive shopping and then send it to the right place for it to be put together for a bomb or whatever, in service of revolution, of course. So just as Rostam is, I would say, before I get to that, let me go through some other revolutionaries that circulated. These are some examples with pictures of people who went from Caucasus to Iran. Nigol Tuman here is in the center. Yeprem Khan, everybody should know by now, the Iranian Constitutional Revolution hero, the Garibaldi of Iran, as he's called, Keri, and Tashnak Sagan Khecho. Others went from the Ottoman Empire to Iran. Mijo is one. Aram Hagopian, I couldn't find a photo for. Sebu, not to be confused with Aslanyan. And then last but not least, Iran to Caucasus, and then back to Iran, Madzun Khecho, and we know what Madzun means, right? Yogurt. Why is he called yogurt? We don't know. And I don't see any on his face, so I'm not sure what it is. But so, just as Rostam and perhaps these revolutionaries as well, there were the quintessential roving revolutionaries. The quintessential roving ideology was socialism. And here we have several examples of papers that appeared, that talked a great I had a series of articles on socialism. One is Hunchag here on your left, the organ of the Hunchagyan Party, Hunchagyan Social Democratic Party. On the bottom is Troshag, means banner, the Armenian Revolutionary Federation's organ, and Murj, which was unaffiliated but also had a leftist approach, so method. So several ideas or ideologies became malleable in the minds and writings of our revolutionaries and intellectuals as they selectively applied aspects of anarchism and socialism and synthesized them into what one would generously call an eclectic blend that suited their reality and served their political and social interests. Revolutionaries were keenly aware of and familiar with European, including Russian, social scientific and socialist literature, as well as with leftist movements and revolutionary stirrings, not only in their backyard and in Europe, but also farther afield. For example, in China and in Cuba, they would often talk about movements there. As such, they shared much with each other, but also with the world around them, which had, in the course of the 19th century and early 20th century, been experimenting with such ideas as constitutionalism and socialism, and had witnessed constitutionalism succeed in parts of Europe and socialism thrive in Western and Central European and Russian political movements. Excuse me. They drew inspirations from such activities and applied their understanding and familiarity to the Russian, Ottoman, and Iranian revolutionary environments. For example, in the case of socialism, they tried to basically find a balance between orthodoxy, Marxist orthodoxy, and reformism. They were most keen about the ideas of French socialist Jean Jaurès. In addition to his anti-militarism and his more favorable view of the national question, what appealed to them in general were four interrelated aspects of his approach. And this is an example of the way that they indigenized and adapted ideologies like socialism. First, they liked his linking of democracy and socialism. Second, his non-determinist conception of history. Third, his advocacy of working across classes with non-socialist liberal bourgeoisie. And fourth, his amalgamation of the ideal and the real. Like Jaurès, they borrowed from Marxism those ideas they found useful and discarded the rest. Therefore, while accepting the very basics of Marxian analysis of economic development, they understood Marx's materialist conception of history in a flexible and nuanced way, thus accepting that economic conflict was not the only driving force of history, and they gave greater importance to ideas and politics. They were also open to working with liberal non-socialist forces and committed to democratic liberal principles along with socialist goals. And the ARF was a very decentralized party, so a number of ideologues also existed within it. So there were the nationalists, there were the socialists, there was everything in between. So what would I like you to take away from the book should you read it? And this is how I'd like to sort of end my presentation before I end it. There are two endings. There's one. This is the one ending. This is the first ending. So the first ending. First, I would like you to appreciate the importance of studying these revolutions, not in isolation or even in comparison, but through connections. And the Armenian case is one such connection. It's not the only one. To view them within their local and regional contexts, but also as part of the global context, and to understand the interplay of facts on the ground with larger historical processes such as revolutions in communication, transportation, and ideology that had deep and wide-ranging ramifications across the world, not just in this region. Second, I would like you to recognize the significance of studying the place of less well-represented and little-studied peoples like the Armenians, and to bring them out of the marginality they have at times inscribed for themselves and others have inscribed for them. To tell a story that's actually more intriguing, that provides a way to foreground histories often hidden by national as well as nationalist approaches. Third, in many ways, Armenians' participation in three revolutions, their journeys across and within imperial frontiers, and their experimentation with global ideologies make them ideal subjects for scholarly inquiry and for grasping the connections between these early 20th century revolutions. They are not the only border crossers, but they are the only border crossers that participated in all three revolutions. Last but not least, I would like to end by reminding ourselves of why Armenians took part in these revolutions. They did so because they believed that the fate of the Armenian populations living in all three empires would actually benefit from the victory, the establishment of a constitution that promised the end of autocracy and arbitrary rule, and the realization of representative government, social and economic justice, harmonious coexistence, yes, it's a tall order, and equality of all citizens regardless of religious and ethnic differences. But this is what they were fighting for. Therefore, the wider participation and collaboration in these revolutionary and constitutional movements must also be seen as part and parcel of the more limited Armenian struggle in the Ottoman and Russian empires, as the campaigns and their participants were intertwined and informed by each other. Our revolutionaries saw the movements as connected and part of the same fight, and therefore so should we. End of conclusion number 1. So, would you like conclusion number 2?
Sure.
So I want to briefly tell the story of the cover. And this illustration actually appears in full in the book, although not in color. The cover does a partial rendering of it but in color, yes. So the first rendition of the cover actually had the Armenian not showing, which kind of defeated the whole purpose, so we brought the Armenian back. Do you recognize this, where this is? What's being depicted? Yes, the Ottoman Empire, right? Turkey. Today's Turkey, part of it. And it is basically from a satirical newspaper that appeared in Tiflis in October of 1908, months after the reinstatement of Constitution and the Young Turk Revolution. It's called Khatabala, which sort of translates into trouble. It's a made-up word of Khata and Bala. And at the center, for those of you who read Armenian or can guess, is a Turk. They're each named, and he is holding a banner that reads unity and equality. On his left and right are other Ottoman subjects. On the west are an Albanian, a Macedonian, and a Greek. On the east are Kurd, in that order, Armenian, Bedouin, Arab, and Jew. And they are all holding banners that read autonomy. The rainbow says Constitution. So I used, and of course you can see the background. It's stormy, it's bleak. It reminds me of Michigan. Oh, sorry. Just kidding. And the idea, the way I saw it, was that this was sort of like the rainbow in Genesis after the flood, where God comes and promises the people that with the rainbow, promises that he will not again rain terror upon them. And so the constitutional revolution, the reinstatement of Constitution, is, according to this satirical newspaper, that promise. And yet, while the Turk is holding the sign that says equality and unity, everybody else wants autonomy. So it was a way to then talk about the most important ideas for the revolutionaries, which were federalism, autonomy, constitutionalism, and of course I added socialism, which does not necessarily appear here, but was another very important idea. And at the bottom of the illustration is a Armenian poem of sorts that translates into May the resplendent rainbow conjoin you poor nations with this sign of conciliation. May they remedy your wounds. And I will stop there. Thank you very much for your attention.
So we have time for questions.
Thank you. I'm not in any way from Armenian studies, so I find this all fascinating. So maybe the question is obvious, but I wonder, I was kind of drawn to your mentioning of how the revolutionaries were affected by Jean Jaurès, and I'm kind of curious about how the stemming of these ideas was organic, or how much of it was in conjunction with Western ideas, maybe Western education, Western languages that were perhaps used here, or maybe influence that was exerted through to control these countries somehow in their revolutions.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a very good question. So basically, this familiarity with socialism or French language literature basically comes from the education that they received in the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire, but also the education that many Armenian youth men went to Europe or were sent to Europe to French schools, to German schools, to Russian schools, and then returned with all these ideas. And in addition, they had contacts with socialists, European socialists and revolutionaries. The Armenian Revolutionary Federation belonged to the Second Socialist International. So there were not only were they reading them, translating them into Armenian, this literature, but also they had actual real contact with them in places like Paris and Geneva and Leipzig and Berlin and so forth.
I have a question about this picture.
Mm-hmm.
So it's definitely very interesting because like you got the rainbow of Constitution in the background, but then you see like all the different characters are doing sort of different styles. They have different reactions to this rainbow. So I'm wondering like how do we connect how these, you know, each of the minority nations or each of the nations represented in this picture, like how what they did like in the history, how did they decide the fate of the nations, you know, following World War I? How do we connect that to their reaction to the rainbow in this picture?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily take it post World War I, only because of my expertise. I'd like to stop before World War I, but I could still answer your question, which is that the way that they are, the poses that they are taking is very telling. So if you look at the Greek, Macedonian, Albanian, they're very agitated, excited, right? They are furling those banners.
Yeah.
On the east, most of the banners are touching the ground, right? So the idea that the Jew, the Arab, the Bedouin, and the Kurd, they don't really care about autonomy. Yeah, the banner's there, but it's not. The Armenian is the only one that's different from the east. He is, yes, he's on his knees, but his banner is erect. And if you look at his gaze, as much as you can from this illustration, he's looking straight at the Balkans. He's looking at the Balkans with admiration, with support, with sympathy. It's not necessarily clear from his eyes because of the illustration, but we know from the history that the Armenians look to the Balkans for a model on which to model their own revolutionary movements.
So I definitely want to read your book, and maybe the question that I'm going to ask you is already there.
I
but
hope
in
so.
In anticipation. So I was wondering, so the argument that you're making obviously is one that there is a readiness of these Armenians who are living in borders, right? And in betweenness, right? At a very particular moment in time where, let's say, revolutionary episteme is ready for them to espouse. And I was wondering, is there, can we differentiate between these different revolutionaries, between Rostam and Yeprem Khan, for instance, right? As far as their personal histories, right? And so as much as one can excavate their biographies, what hooks them, right? I mean, because obviously it's not enough to say that you're born into a milieu and an episteme is ready for you to just draw on it. Yeah. But I'm sure there are also real differences between the revolutionaries that you're working on, or you have worked on.
Yes.
And what is it? What is that moment in time you think that they get hooked? And what are these different trajectories that hook them onto this revolutionary path?
Yeah. It's an excellent question. I'm not sure I answer in the book, but I'll try to answer it here as much as possible. There's a huge difference between somebody like Rostam and Yeprem Khan. Not only in terms of their education. I mean, Yeprem Khan wasn't really educated. He didn't go to college like Rostam did. I mean, yes, they went to agricultural college, but agricultural college was like the center of revolutionary activity for some reason, which begs the question as why UC Davis hasn't actually protested and revolted yet. But You have to know UC Davis. And another difference is not only the education level and the family that they come from, but also the kind of influence that Rostam and the other co-founders of the ARF, for example, had, or the leaders of the Anjak party. And it's almost it's a very sort of elitist kind of background and trajectory, as opposed to Yeprem Khan, who is much more sort of the people in many ways. And the one thing that makes a great difference in the way that their trajectories separate, are distinct, is that the Russian influence on Rostam, his co-founder Kristapor Mikhailyan, are tremendous. And it is the moment, but it's a Russian moment almost, with Yeprem Khan doesn't get. And then there are also those who are much more nationalist in the ARF, the ones that I don't really talk about because there's so much discussion about the nationalists. And they are not under Russian influence. They are more sort of Ottoman influenced. So there are different influences that also help them go in different directions.
My question was going to be exactly about nationalism and socialism within the ARF, because from my own readings and research, it seems that the ARF was pretty nationalist after all, because most of their members, if not all, were Armenian exclusively, unless you actually have some examples which will prove otherwise. Did they have any other members which are non-Armenian?
No, but that makes it a national party, not necessarily nationalist.
Right, so I wonder if you could talk about nationalism, the duality of nationalism and socialism within the ARF, and how the different branches, different centuries were dealing with this and still remaining a coherent party.
So, good question. So the ARF was a decentralized party. It actually entertained a number of different strains within it. It is largely known as a nationalist party that dabbled in socialism. And one of the things I wanted to show is that it's not just a dabbling in socialism for many of these people. Not all of the party, any more than we can say that all of the party was nationalist. And that there was actually, for them, just as for the Georgian socialists or for other socialists, there was really no contradiction between a national homeland, autonomy, reforms for the people, social economic justice, the end to ethnic antagonism. All of those things did not go against the ideal socialist state which they wanted to strive towards. So it both existed at different times. One was stronger than the other, and several times, and it actually happened in the Henchagyan case, it split the party. In the ARF's case, they were able to hold it together because of their decentralization, because they allowed, and this was the sort of the Jean Jaurès move, right? We can work across class lines. Even with our own party, we can have bourgeois liberals, we can have socialist radicals, and so forth. For those socialists who thought that the ARF was too nationalist, they left. For the nationalists who thought that at times the ARF was becoming too socialist, they left. But in the Henchagyan case, the party was actually split. And that's why it didn't remain as strong and as dominant as the ARF. Hope that answers it. Yes.
Thank you, Houri. Great to have you here, and
Thank you.
quite flattered to be sharing the name of your revolutionary. I think it's intentional, but I really
on your
appreciate
parents' part, perhaps.
Yes. I really appreciate the approach you're taking and how we are being asked to because part of the silence about where Armenians keep falling out of historiography is because of the nation state and the way we read historiography from the vantage point of the nation state that didn't exist of the time. And therefore, I think you bring a very compelling case for a different reading of history. So I really appreciated that. Now, I wanted to ask you about the picture again,
Mhm.
because on one level, the Balkans went through the rise of nationalism and the nation state and so on. On another, the Armenians, revolutionaries that you were talking about, were for constitutional reform and not for a nation state project as it happened in the Balkans. So I wonder if you can comment
Sure.
about that, how the Armenians are looking at the Balkans at the same time, constitutional reform. And the other, after hearing your explanation about the different characters on the map,
Mhm.
on the picture, there is also the question of Orientalism
Oh, yes.
as well, right? Where the Arab and the Jew are incapable of
Yes.
a revolution and
Right.
so on.
Yes. So I'll start with the second one. The illustrator Rotter is actually a Caucasian, like South Caucasian-born German. So, if that helps put things into perspective. As for the Balkans, yes, the Balkans did go through through exactly what you said, but they're also the ones that the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, the socialists, and the federalists are interested in are the ones that are talking about federation. So there are still those among them, especially in the Macedonian case, in the Bulgarian case, where they are talking about being part of a larger federation, whether it's a Balkan federation or even an Ottoman federation. So within the Balkan movements, there's also distinctions and differences between the nationalists who are for an independent nation state and those who are still thinking in terms of federation. After World War I, none of this, obviously, it's all gone. This is why I didn't want to talk about it. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I was wondering, while you were reading the periodicals, if you came across ideas of gender, whether gendering the nation or women's role in the revolution, how they imagined that.
Right. So that's a very interesting question, and I actually just completed an article on the one woman revolutionary, Rubina, who helped organize and carry out the attempted assassination of Sultan Abdul Hamid. And there is not much on Armenian women revolutionaries. When they are mentioned, they are auxiliary. They are basically, helping pass around bullets, helping hide revolutionaries, helping hide arms and weapons. That doesn't mean that those are not important roles, but nevertheless, they are hardly ever, if at all, talked about as actual fighting revolutionaries. And I don't talk about women in this book very much because they're not circulating. And I have this, I'll come back to your question, but I have this great what's the word? Anecdote. Thank you. Anecdote about Rostam. Rostam runs into his wife on the street in Tiflis. And she's very surprised to see him because she didn't know he was in town. And she says, "Oh," I'm sure she didn't call him Rostam, she said Stepan. "Stepan, what are you doing here? How long have you been here?" He goes, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I've been here 7 days, but I've been so busy I haven't had a chance to come by." And she very generously and nonchalantly says, "Well, when you have time, come by the house too." So she's not circulating, right? There are very few, if at all, are. Rubina circulated. She went from the Caucasus to Europe, to the Ottoman Empire, to Greece, back to the Caucasus, and so forth. But she's one of the few that we know of. That doesn't mean it didn't happen, but we don't know of that many. And the way that her story is handled during and after, I'm sure you're not going to be surprised, is incredibly gendered. She becomes the hysterical woman who wanted to sacrifice herself, who could not handle things, and yet they gave her, at the time, put the bomb in her hands basically and said, go kill him. So, but there's more to the story, but I think that helps answer part of your question.
Hi. Thank you so much. This was absolutely fascinating. I have two questions. The first one is, who's funding these travels of these?
Mm-hmm.
Rostam travels over 21 years. So
Yeah.
that must
Mm-hmm.
require a considerable sum of money.
Yes.
So if you could talk about
Sure.
that a little bit.
Sure. So one of the interesting things about Rostam is he has a great sense of humor, but he's also constantly complaining about how much money, how little money he has. And what he wants to do is not to worry about money and just live the life of the revolutionary. The funding is coming from membership dues, but also extortion, special little revolutionary taxes on the bourgeoisie. And they should help the nation. And it's also coming from businesses that they themselves run, cafes and other things. So it's a number of ways, but there's a lot of extortion happening as well.
So my second question was connected to that. Could you talk about the other side of the coin, the counter-revolutionary, reactionary movements? Was that a transnational thing as well?
This is a very interesting question, and it's come up many times. And I think that there is room for a study on that. It's just that I haven't done it, and I don't know to what extent it was transnational. It's very possible it was. All of them have coups. I mean, all these revolutions have coups, one or more. So it would be very interesting to see whether, these counter-revolutionaries are actually circulating as well. But I can't tell you. I don't know. Yes?
My question is, could you be a revolutionary without being a socialist, it looks like? And the Armenians weren't socialists at all, so in their transformation, they had nothing to do with socialism, and consequently got readjusted and readjusted. Could you?
Yeah.
And I thought this had something to do with the mid-century revolutions in Europe, but I never thought about that as having a socialist angle to it. So I always thought they got their inspiration from the European revolutions, which were political for their independence, and then without the socialists, according to what we're seeing, is they're not really revolutionaries.
No.
Armenians got transformed into several different things, and there was nothing socialist about them.
Yeah, that's very true, but you don't have to be a socialist to be a revolutionary. The Armenians were not socialists. They were also gone by the time that these revolutions started. The socialism is coming from two different places. One from the Russians, especially the Russian socialist revolutionaries, not the social democrats. But it's also coming from French socialism, not so much German socialism, although they do make attempts to incorporate German social democrats like Karl Kautsky and others. So the socialism is coming from two different, from the East, from the Russian and from the Western European angle. But there are, the nationalists are revolutionaries without being socialists, so it's not necessarily tied to each other. In my case, it is.
Required ingredient.
No, no.
Thank you for your talk. I really appreciated all the manifold interconnectedness that you bring out. And so I also had a question about differences between different Armenian revolutionary groups and especially locations. And was just wondering if you could talk more about what kinds of friction exist in their movements, both across borders, but especially within different kinds of communities. When like a revolutionary from Istanbul meets one from Isfahan, what gets negotiated between them? Or maybe kind of going back to what you were asking, what doesn't move so well across these networks?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure I have a satisfactory answer for you. I can say that on the lighter side, even Bastırma is moving. So there, all kinds of things. Yes, all kinds of things are circulating, and I did not see in the news, in the periodicals, or in the correspondence, any friction between the different revolutionaries from different locales. But I imagine there were, but I didn't see them. Somebody also asked me a question about language, Eastern, Western Armenian, and I didn't see that either. Those who spoke Eastern used Eastern, those who spoke Western used Western. There are instances like Simon Zavarian, one of the co-founders of the ARF, who gives a talk in Eastern Armenian in Istanbul on federalism, and when it is published as a book, it is translated into Western Armenian. But it's about Ottoman federalism. So that, I assume, is a way to appeal to Ottoman Armenian subjects. So there must have been some friction. I'm just not the one to talk about it. But this opens up a whole new path for grad students. Yes.
It's fascinating. So I am going to read the book.
Thanks. Okay, then I'm leaving.
It was. I said that so that you stay.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So I know you don't want to speak about beyond this point or before this point, perhaps. I just wanted to say something about my understanding of the history of that area that is, the junction between the Persians, the Ottomans, and so forth, and the Russians. That area is historically back to the Neolithic times. Was the place where the Armenians were. Even the time of the Achaemenids, there are settlements, Achaemenid cities that called that area Armenia, Armenistan, or Arstan. And I don't want to sophisticate the situation any more than to say that this connectivity of purpose, so to speak, here is very old.
I'm not talking about connectivity, though. I'm talking about connected histories, which is about circulation.
I recognize that.
Okay. And there's no.
But there was a question about Rostam. Why is it that just the fact that he was born in that area ended up how did it make him a revolutionary? How did was it just because he was born there and was the connectivity or of the? So I'm just proposing that there might be a sense of culture and a sense of even linguistics and geographic sense that the roots of this sort of flowering revolutionary could be far further. Because even Rostam is a name that is in the Shahnameh.
Yes.
And it's
But this is Rostom.
okay. Well, you know, and
I see what you're saying. I see what you're
it's,
saying, yes.
Mythologically,
Okay.
the two cultures are sort of connected. You know,
We don't have to go mythology. The two cultures are very much connected.
Yeah. And you know,
In-
during
in-
the
in-
Islamic Revolution, there were Armenian soldiers in the fight against the Iraq.
Yes.
It was, you know, it.
And Iranians go to Armenia all the time now. I'm just taking it further.
Yeah. So you see.
Yes.
Right. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
for your
Thank you.